We're joined now on the podcast by Guardian columnist Owen Jones and Katy from the Spectator. Thanks both for coming in. You've both got your own podcasts, so it'd only be fair for us to allow you to promote them first before you appear on ours. So, Katy?
We have a daily, sometimes more than daily, podcast Coffee House Shots on all good iTunes stores.
Yeah.
Not something like I've got election daily, but it's it's done. The election's happened.
Okay, not going to carry it.
R.I.P.
The way you're
Well, it's
feeling
not the
right
election
now.
daily, is it, anymore? The election is definitely over. That's one thing we can agree on.
Well, talking of things that might be over, sorry, that's an awful segue for you, but Jeremy Corbyn's leadership and the Corbyn project after tonight, yes or no?
Well, I mean, do I think he's going to remain as leader? No, obviously. But I think, look, I mean, this election, I travelled the length and breadth of this country. I went from Aberconway to Broxtowe, Mansfield to Glasgow. Did anyone slam the door in the face of people like myself and others because they said, well, actually, we don't support public ownership of utilities, or we don't think rich people should pay more tax, we don't think there should be more investment in services, we don't think tuition fees should be scrapped? No one did. That just never happened. On the Brexit culture war, which has enveloped this nation and envelops the Corbyn project as well, I wish I had an answer. I was one of those who didn't support a second referendum and thought, even though I didn't like the referendum result, we had to make it work. And after the European elections, I thought was untenable. Labour hemorrhaged mass support to the Liberal Democrats. Labour started this election campaign on average 2 points ahead of the Lib Dems. And, there was talk of the Lib Dems replacing the Labour Party as a consequence. So they had to pivot to support a new referendum, even though people like me were reluctant to support that. I thought that was the only alternative. But I think the two things that have caused this result tonight are that even though it's true, and this has been pointed out by political scientists, that most Labour voters are Remainers by a large degree, Labour can't win without the Leave wing of its electoral coalition, and they have defected Labour en masse tonight. It is true that in Leave seats, most Labour voters are Remainers. But it's also true that if the Leave contingent of that coalition defects, then they will lose those seats. Yeah. And that has happened in seats that Labour have represented for decades. I know people go, you're just making excuses. This is about Jeremy Corbyn. That comes up more on the doorstep. But from my experience, and if we think back to 2017 when Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party enjoyed the biggest increase in Labour's vote share since 1945, going from 30% to 40%. My very distinct impression on the doorstep and travelling the country is the fall in support and very acute support for Jeremy Corbyn had a lot to do with Brexit, in that he was seen as weak and indecisive. Did I think that was fair? No, because I thought Labour had an impossible hand on Brexit. But because Labour was so obsessed with not leaving their Leave wing, and you can see why they were worried about it, they struggled for many, many months, if not longer, to come up with a coherent, settled Brexit position. And in that time, people thought they were weak and indecisive and unable to speak on the main issue facing the country. But I still don't know what they were supposed to do, given that most of their supporters were Remainers and were defecting from them, and yet they couldn't win without their Leavers. I don't know what the answer to that is.
Katy?
Look, I mean, we're still getting the results in. It's just an exit poll right now, but it would have to be pretty badly wrong for it not to be leaned to a comfortable Conservative majority.
And the swings so far.
Yeah, the swings so far are pretty
we're
consistent with that. And if you speak to activists on the ground and the Tories, they seem very confident in a lot of these traditional Labour heartlands, known as the Red Wall throughout this election. Clearly, Brexit is a very big issue. I think the Tories think they were helped by two things. Probably more than two, but primarily Brexit, the fact that Labour's second referendum policy helped them, but also Jeremy Corbyn, and I think it did come up for them. I suppose right now, I think in terms of the Tory strategy, it's clearly one of celebration if this does prove correct. But they're also going to have a job on their hands if you think about this new coalition of voters, because the Conservative Party is now, if we are correct, comprised of, Tory libertarians and Labour Leave voters. And what does that mean for Brexit? Because I think that this is going to put pressure on Boris Johnson to think about protectionism in a way. I think we could, in theory, be heading to a slightly softer Brexit if you think about keeping this, this band of voters together. And ultimately, now that if he has a majority in the region of 80, not quite a landslide, I think there has to be 100, but it's getting there. He's no longer beholden to one end of his party. I think figures like Marc Francois from the European Research Group of Tory Brexiteers are no longer going to be able to have what you might call tantrums and say they don't like this. And likewise on the other side, although lots of them have gone already, Tory MPs who are worried about no deal and that potential are going to have less of a voice. So it's all onto Boris Johnson and what he actually picks. But what's interesting is no one's exactly sure what Boris Johnson thinks on Brexit. Lots of people go into meetings, they say something to him, and they leave thinking he's agreed, and then it turns out to be a bit different. So it's still a little bit unclear how he is going to wield this power that he has been given.
Before I bring you in, Shehab, we made that point, didn't we, about the Tories?
Yeah.
We were talking about earlier about, for Boris Johnson, he has now a 5-year parliamentary term ahead of him. As you say, there are big questions over what he actually thinks on Brexit, and he won't want his entire premiership to be dominated by it. And in a way, you have that cliff edge at the end of next year, December 2020. In your view, it's a very hard question to answer, but in your view, will he be tempted here to come up with a softer Brexit, as aligned to the EU as possible, to get that trade deal done as fast as he can, so that he can, as he's been saying, move on to talk about the things he wants to talk about?
Well, I think you will see probably Boris Johnson and his team, many of whom are from the Vote Leave campaign, doing what they've always wanted to do, which is be able to almost use the threat of a no-deal Brexit to put pressure on Brussels. And previously in the last Parliament, they were not able to do that because MPs would put through legislation to force them to seek an extension. So I think they will use pressure. But I think one of Boris Johnson's strengths, particularly if you look at the Brexit deal, which is oven ready, to use his words, is I think had Theresa May pushed that forward, it wouldn't necessarily have flown in terms of MPs. He can sell things that someone who voted to remain could not. So I don't think it will be as hard a Brexit as some expect. But the one thing he is clear on is the UK has to be able to be competitive in terms of business. So I think that will be an aspect of it.
Owen, it's been a disappointing night. You mentioned that you don't expect Jeremy Corbyn to carry on. Where does the Labour Party go from here? There's likely to be a major fallout, not just tonight, I'm talking over the next few weeks, maybe the next few months, deciding the direction of the Labour Party. Do you think someone from the similar platform, Jeremy Corbyn, will come in as leader, or do you think someone from the right in the Labour Party, a more moderate MP, is going to come forward and replace?
Well, it's not the domestic policy agenda that sealed the fate of Labour in this election. It's not that people didn't think that rich people should pay more tax to invest in the economy or public services, or they didn't agree with public ownership. That's not, and all the polling is very clear on that. Most people support that. I've met lots of people across the country who said they would support the policies, but they won't support Labour for very distinct and clear other reasons, normally centring on Brexit and their view of Jeremy Corbyn largely connected to Brexit. And I think the dilemma for Labour now is, how do they win back seats which Labour has held for many, many decades, which voted to leave the European Union 2.5 years ago. And those voters do feel very angry that, 3.5 years ago, they feel very angry that, as they see it, a referendum in which they voted and won a majority mandate for them to leave the European Union wasn't respected. And I'm afraid, whether, I was a moderate Remainer. I was someone who was like, let's make this work. But there was no question that even though Labour's main supporters supported leaving and staying in the European Union, a minority who play a decisive role in general elections very passionately wanted to leave. So now, and these problems didn't start, by the way, with the referendum. You saw in Scotland how, Labour wouldn't exist without Scotland. This was the heartland of the Labour Party. All the first leaders of the Labour Party were Scottish. And you saw how very quickly Labour was swiped away in north of the border, very decisively. They went from 41 seats in 2010 to 1 5 years later. And those problems were decades in the making, and it just needed an event, in that case the Scottish referendum, to crystallise that. And you saw that has happened with the EU referendum. And though Labour was able to, attempt to compromise in 2017 that brought those different wings together, the polarisation since has made that absolutely impossible. How does Labour, A, bring back those Leave voters, and B, deal with the disaffection amongst particularly older working class voters in certain seats, because we're not talking about younger working class people who flock to Labour. I don't have the answer to that yet, and I don't know what Labour should do to answer that. But it's not by abandoning public ownership or higher taxes on the rich, because that has nothing to do with it.
In the ITV debate, in the election night programme at the moment, as we've been talking, John Landsman has been on, Alan Johnson has been on, and they've been properly going at each other. And that's two people from the Labour Party on two very different wings of the party, essentially arguing over what the party should do next and who's at fault if this exit poll is correct. That's what's going to be playing out over the next 2 months. We're going to have the two wings of the Labour Party really going after each other.
We've seen already Phil Wilson and others saying
we're watching
this on
it unfold
Jeremy Corbyn
immediately. Jeremy Corbyn's biggest
fault,
critics are saying he is to blame and the Corbyn project is why we're in this position.
Yeah,
do you think this could be the end of the Corbyn project altogether? And could we go back to a new Labour style of...
No, because as I've said, it's not the policies that are the problem. In 2015, Labour...
So to be clear, in your opinion then, you think a different Labour leader but on a roughly the same domestic platform could be more successful in 5 years' time?
In terms of the domestic, I'm not talking about Brexit, which is
What
has ruptured Labour's electoral coalition. The idea that working class voters in Northern England or the Midlands thought, you know what, I was going to support Labour, but they wanted to hike taxes on the top 5% and they wanted to bring rail under public ownership, so I'm not going to vote Labour this time. That was Labour's policy prospectus in 2017, and Labour won 40% of the vote, which is the exact same share of the vote that Labour won under Tony Blair in 2001 when they won a landslide. Obviously it was different because the Tories also won a higher share of the vote, which is why there was a hung parliament. But it wasn't to do the domestic policies. Why did 40% of the population vote for a Corbyn-led leadership, a Corbyn-led Labour Party in 2017 with the policies like taxing the rich, public ownership and scrapping tuition fees? But they didn't this time. And that's because of that polarisation over Brexit. That's what changed.
But even in 2017, they did better than clearly tonight, but they didn't win. So the point being is, you think even on this platform, the question is, can they win a majority? Not can they do better than tonight or as well as 2017. If the idea for the Labour is to get back into government, you seriously still believe this agenda can get Labour a majority? Only
if the culture war, of which Brexit is, by the way, is a kind of proximate kind of cause, and we saw that in Scotland. You know, the Scottish nationalism didn't suddenly emerge out of nowhere in sweep or before it in 2015. The SNP didn't go from 6 seats to 56 seats in 5 years out of nowhere. That was decades in the making. But I have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that those policies on public ownership, higher tax on the rich, investment in the economy, getting rid of tuition fees are popular policies. I think the reason in Leave seats that predominantly Leave voting Labour voters have left the Labour Party centres on Brexit and on the culture war which Brexit has become. And even though there will be many people on the right and Tories who will argue against that on your podcast and on air, but deep down, if they look back at what happened in 2017, I think if they were being honest with themselves, they would accept the fact they don't really think Labour's economic or domestic policies are unpopular. They think that Labour's Leave voters, predominantly older voters in North and the Midlands who Labour needs to win, left over other profound cultural reasons which Labour will struggle to address, but has to.
Your thoughts on that?
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you look at 2017, clearly lots of the policies in the Labour manifesto were really popular, rail nationalisation particularly, and it took lots in the Tory party by surprise. And I think Brexit is a big issue in this. But I think one of the things I've heard from people on the doorstep when you looked at Labour's package this time was almost, you did get the sense that there is this view in the Labour Party that actually the best thing was to be even more radical to show you had more clear blue water with the Tory party. And that was partly because the Tory party had almost moved in Labour's direction in terms of higher spending. But I think a few of those policies seem to undermine the message. So one thing you heard a lot from Tory MPs and also coming up in focus groups was this 4-day week. And it was often cited as an example of people thinking that perhaps the whole package wasn't that credible, the idea that you could do a 4-day working week but still be paid the same as a full working week. And I think that could have been an issue as a domestic policy. But clearly Brexit was an issue as well. But I do think if you look at the package this time, it was more radical, and I think for some people it didn't pass a basic smell test.
Owen, appreciate it. Katy, thank you very much. Listen to their podcast, just not necessarily as much listen to ours. Thank you very much.